The official kickoff to the 2020 presidential election, how what happens in Iowa impacts Arizona.
They give voters a cue as to who's viable and who is not.
Ensuring ballots are safe and secure, an inside look at the Pima County Election Center.
We want the public to be voting.
Pima County leaders say no to federal funding along Arizona's southern border, what that means for taxpayers.
With Stonegarden, there's a pension cost, and there's a long-term pension cost.
Hello and welcome to Arizona 360. I'm Lorraine Rivera. Thank you for joining us. Democrats' race for the White House began with a stagger out of Iowa this week. Technical issues delayed the results and became the headline. Historically, the event serves as the kickoff to the primary season. This year, Iowa's Democratic Party tried something new that brought the caucus to southern Arizona. Christopher Conover has more.
Are you a caucuser? Yes. What is your first name? Mariana.
50 Iowans who call Green Valley home in the winter gathered Monday night in a clubhouse meeting room to take part in the Iowa caucus.
Let the games begin.
They all registered to participate in the first ever satellite caucus.
There was an email that went out from the Democratic Party. Do you know of another place that perhaps should have a caucus? And I had always thought, well, why not down south? Because a lot of us come here for a while and we can't go back and caucus.
Swan says she and her husband started spending winters away from Iowa about a decade ago. So they haven't been able to participate in the caucuses until now. The caucuses operate under strict rules, including when they begin.
6 o'clock. Okay, 6 o'clock.
There it is. Once the door was locked at 6 p.m., the rules for the caucus were explained.
The first order of business is we need to elect a permanent caucus chair and secretary.
And then participants had 15 minutes to decide who to support, standing under the name of their candidate. But if a candidate did not get 15% support, they were deemed not viable.
If you go with a candidate that reaches that viability threshold, then you are there, that you can't change after that. We will do a second alignment, but that's only for people that are in a non-viable group.
And with the rules explained, the caucus alignments began. And then the first round of counting.
Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
After the first count, candidates that failed to reach viability included Bernie Sanders, Michael Bloomberg, and Elizabeth Warren. After 15 minutes, the counting began again, and the results were then read, spelling out how many of the 6 delegates designated for Green Valley that each candidate would get.
And what we ended up with is Biden would receive 1 delegate, Buttigieg 2, and Klobuchar 3.
For some participants, the satellite caucus location saved them a flight from Arizona to Iowa. Jack Runnels says he considered that option.
When she found out about this, and it was just, she was so excited. And it is so good. I hope they go ahead and do this, forever. Which I'm 88 years old, so that don't need to be too much longer.
Iowa residents were invited to participate in satellite caucuses in nearly 90 locations around the U.S. and 3 international locations. Despite the convenience, not everyone was a fan.
I'm not sold on it. It's a party-building exercise, and I think it helps more to do it within your group and at home. But it's nice to have a chance to express your opinion and meet other Democrats. So I enjoy that part of it.
Thank you for coming.
Registered Democrats in Arizona have several weeks before they weigh in on the presidential candidates. By then, more than 24 other states will have already had their say. Whether or not those outcomes will sway voters here, we got insight from Samara Klar, a political scientist at the University of Arizona.
So right away, we're going to get a lot of attention in Iowa, but it also recently has a pretty good track record of predicting who the Democratic nominee is going to be. So if you look historically, it predicts about less than half the time. But if you look in the last 20 years, since the year 2000, it's actually predicted the nominee every single year.
All right, after Iowa, then New Hampshire, are these states really representative of what's happening throughout the rest of the country when it comes to politics?
Demographically, these states are not at all representative. I mean, Iowa and New Hampshire are significantly whiter. They're not nowhere near as diverse as the rest of the country. They're also older than the rest of the country. So it's not as though they're a microcosm of the country, but rather they give voters a cue as to who's viable and who's not. So part of the reason why we see that the Iowa winner tends to predict the official nominee is because it gives people a heuristic. Well, if voters there like him or her, then maybe this person has a real shot.
In a lot of circles, Arizona is considered this battleground state.
Yeah,
Any
for sure.
indication that Arizona could, move up its place when it comes to primaries and people will start to look at Arizona?
Yes, I mean, I know I said this 4 years ago, and now I believe it even more strongly. Arizona really is becoming a battleground state. I mean, it really hasn't been a traditionally Republican state until about the 80s. And in the last 30 years now, it's been fairly consistently Republican. Not always. We've had a few elections here or there. For example, Bill Clinton won in Arizona. But what we've seen in the last few years is a real influx of Democratic registrants, especially this year. So in July, we had this huge increase in new voters registering in Arizona. The majority of them were registering as Democrats. And another kind of interesting thing, I think, is in the past few months, the majority of registrants have identified with a party, which we haven't typically seen in Arizona. Arizona's been a pretty independent state, and it's actually moving to become a little more partisan. So I think there's a lot of interest here among the candidates and among the campaigns.
Do Arizona Democrats tend to look at these other states, and does it influence their decision making?
Yeah, they do. I mean, in the past several years, Arizona has chosen the same Democratic nominee that Iowa has. One notable exception is that Arizona selected Hillary Clinton over Barack Obama in that primary, whereas Iowa did not. So Arizona voters are potentially a little more conservative among the Democrats than we see in a state like Iowa. But again, that could change also. A lot of our new registrants here are not white, they are not older, they're sort of younger, more diverse voters. So we might see a move to the left. Bernie Sanders has been polling really well in Arizona, for example. And in 2016, Bernie Sanders actually had a few campaigns here in Tucson and throughout the state. So I think we will see some more campaign activity.
As these caucuses continue and the herd gets thinned out, does
Yep.
it change the vote of the Arizonan as things continue to progress? Because we won't be having this conversation until March.
Well, it depends how thin the herd gets. I mean, right now, the popular voters in Arizona are really the big players. Warren, Sanders, Biden is leading in Arizona in most polls. So those ones are probably not going to get out anytime soon. Arizona voters aren't really looking at sort of smaller candidates. But as, Arizona's primary follows Super Tuesday. So by the time we get to Arizona, the herd will have thinned down. I think we're at 11 now. I wouldn't be surprised if Arizona voters have a choice among maybe 6 or 7.
The media, are they playing this up more than it should be? I mean, at the end of the day, is the average voter really watching what happens in Iowa or New Hampshire and saying, that's how I'm going to vote and that's what deserves my attention?
I mean, the average voter is not watching the news all day. The average voter is at work, they're dealing with their kids, they're grocery shopping, they're fixing their leaky pipes, they're dealing with their lives. But Iowa's a really big deal because this is a huge election. Donald Trump is a really polarizing figure. He's consistently been very popular among Republicans. He's consistently been very unpopular among Democrats. So this is a race that a lot of people have a real stake in. I mean, it's an election that matters to a lot of voters, and Iowa's going to be an important signal to a lot of voters throughout the country.
I read that 16% of Iowa voters will actually turn out for a caucus, and that politicians are spending about $50 million this year in Iowa alone. Those numbers don't seem to mesh.
No, I know. It's unbelievable. The amount of money they spend every year just exponentially grows. It gets higher and higher, but this is just seen as such a big signal to them. It's going to give a lot of adrenaline to the campaign that wins for sure, and even to the campaign that comes in second or third.
All right, Dr. Klar, a lot more to look forward to in the coming months.
Thank you so much for having me. It'll be really exciting to see what happens.
Arizona's Democratic presidential preference election is March 17th. The deadline to register to vote is February 18th. Because Arizona Republicans decided not to have a primary, independent voters who want to vote in the primary must register as Democrats. They can switch back after. In Pima County, election officials want to reassure voters their systems are secure. To get the word out, they offered an inside look at how they process mail ballots.
Pima County and Southern Arizona elections are going as smoothly as possible.
According to Pima County Recorder F.N. Rodriguez, 80% of voters receive their ballots in the mail. Counting the ones they get back involves a series of steps that begins when they arrive at the post office.
There's always two people, different party affiliations, present and handling them at all times.
Workers pick them up in a secure area and bring them back to the Pima County's election department.
They'll take a stack of envelopes, place it against the thing.
The first step is simple, to make sure each yellow envelope actually contains a signed ballot, which isn't always the case.
We find prescription pills, we find other bills that people have put in while they're
Got a recipe for Rice Krispie treats one year.
If someone notices any serious discrepancies, a so-called trouble team will contact the voter to clear up the confusion. That happens if two people raise questions about whether a signature matches what's on file.
Probably most of the ballots that we work on, they're able to confirm the signature on the affidavit based on the first one that pops up here.
Finally, the machines used to count and tally the results undergo testing by the state beforehand. The political parties can also do their own test on site. As added security, all the equipment runs on a standalone system.
Every device, you can follow that line all the way back to the server and also tell that the server is not connected to anything or any device as well.
While all this happens behind the scenes, voters can track their ballot status online at recorder.pima.gov. There, they can also check their registration info and verify key deadlines. Rodriguez says she hopes residents trust that their vote will count in 2020.
So much misinformation is put out there on Twitter and Facebook that it puts doubt on the public, and we don't want doubt with the public. We want the public to be voting. This is democracy, and this is how it works.
Come Election Day, voters will have a single choice to make for president, but a grassroots movement in southern Arizona aims to give them the option to check all of the boxes and rank their favorite candidates from first to last. Recently, Christopher Conover spoke to organizers about their efforts to establish ranked choice voting in Arizona.
Let's explain how ranked choice voting works. Take this sample ballot with the 2016 presidential candidates. A voter would pick their first choice, as usual, but then have the option to rank the rest in order of preference. If a candidate can't win more than half of the vote as a first choice, then the rules of ranked choice voting kick in. The candidate in last place gets eliminated, and voters who ranked that person first have their second choice tallied toward the remaining candidates. If that still doesn't give a candidate a majority of over 50%, the process continues until there's a winner.
Vote with your heart, not just your strategic brain.
That brings us to Adam Friedman, who helped spearhead a ballot initiative in Massachusetts that could see the state adopt ranked choice voting by 2022. Last month, the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson invited him to speak about building support at the grassroots level. We learned more from Friedman and local organizer Francis Epson.
Why is it better than the system we're using now, where we'll take the presidential preference election that's coming up in Arizona as an example? There'll be 10, 15 people on the ballot. I pick one. Why is this system better?
There is a list of reasons why this system is better, and it's all rooted in some systemic cultural problems in the way that we vote and in American politics today. I speak at a lot of rooms, and I ask people, raise your hand if you're sick and tired of negative campaigning. Every hand goes up. Raise your hand if you're worried sometimes about supporting a candidate you really like, but you're worried about throwing your vote away if you were to vote for them. Most hands go up. Or you might want to vote for a front runner, but there could be someone in the race that's similar to that front runner that siphons votes away from them, what we call the quote-unquote spoiler. And most hands go up in the room. We also have problems of voter apathy and low voter turnout. And ranked choice voting is an elegant way to cut through all of these problems.
So what's Arizona's role in this? Right now we have what we'll call traditional voting, but you'd like to see that change.
I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see us get away from just exactly what he was saying. I read an article by a wonderful woman, Rivko Knox, who is up in Phoenix. She's the legislative advocate for League of Women Voters. And she explained what happened in the mayoral election in Phoenix. There was no majority, so they had to have a later runoff, and that cost the taxpayers about $1 million, plus less voters turn out. When it doesn't happen instantly, the second time around, voters don't turn out.
So what's the path, Francis, to get this as the way we vote in Arizona? And are you actively working on that path?
So the first thing was to get a national speaker who's qualified to speak on this, which was why we brought in Adam. It'll take a lot of voter education. We need people to come and sign up to start moving it.
The phase of organizing for Arizona is really building the grassroots organization, starting that movement, starting to attract more people onto the idea itself of ranked choice voting, and a vision for what's possible in our politics and our elections. That will take some time. That could be a year or two or more. And then when activists are ready and when there's a big, level of public support for this, then we'll move to the next phase. And it could come in the form of a bill through the State House. There's a number of ways to do it.
More than a dozen municipalities in 9 states use ranked choice voting for their local elections, including Santa Fe, San Francisco, and Minneapolis. Maine is the only state to implement it at the state and federal level.
And a lot of folks ask, do voters understand ranked choice voting? Is this complicated?
That's always the big criticism. It's too complicated, people won't understand it.
Right. And so people can argue back and forth in theory. But I ask folks, just look at the actual experience of voters in these communities that are using it. In Santa Fe, the first ever mayoral race that they had in 2018, 88% of voters used the rankings. So you have the option with ranked choice voting to only rank one. So if you're not comfortable taking advantage of more power on your ballot, you can do so. You can just do the one, just like you vote now.
As far as not understanding it, there was something that was quoted in Rifko's article. It said, I trust the voters to be intelligent enough to figure out what their first, second, and third choice voting is. It's kind of like going into 31 flavors and saying, I'll have that flavor. Oh, but if you don't have it, I'll have the other one.
This week, the Pima County Board of Supervisors voted not to accept federal funding designed to support law enforcement in counties along the U.S.-Mexico border, also known as Operation Stonegarden Grant Program. That means a loss of more than $1 million. Paul Ingram from the Tucson Sentinel joins me now with more on the controversial vote. Paul, thanks for being here.
Sure, thank you.
What's changed? Because for so many years, beginning back in 2008, Pima County has received upwards of $16 million over the years.
Mm-hmm. For the last 12 years, up until 2018, this was part of the consent agenda. It was something that they would pass with a voice vote, among a bunch of other things. What's changed is, to a large degree, I think, the Trump administration. The Trump administration has really poisoned the politics, soured the politics about Operation Stonegarden. And that is also coupled with a lot of activists who really don't want the Sheriff's Department to use Operation Stonegarden funding because they really see it as a way of getting the sheriff's deputies to collaborate with Border Patrol.
So part of this discussion surrounded funding for humanitarian aid. Remind our viewers that it is something that you could apply to the federal government for, but the feds said no?
Yeah, so the idea was that they would take about $200,000 out of about $1.5 million to spend on humanitarian aid. And when they sent that to FEMA and to CBP, those agencies said, no, that's not how Operation Stonegarden works. Instead, you have to use a different funding source for money that you want to use for humanitarian aid.
So who's on the hook for paying for things like gasoilitas when Pima County said we want to have a place for these people who are traversing through Pima County, whether they come through the Migrant Protection Protocol, but they're temporarily in Pima County? Who's on the hook for paying for all that?
Well, in a lot of ways, still the federal government. The county has requested a bunch of different grants, and those have actually kind of started to fill in, but the county still has to fill in about more than $500,000, almost $600,000 for costs. A lot of that was actually for setting up the Casa Elitas Welcome Center, which is set at the Juvenile Detention Center, and that was about $600,000 in costs specifically there. So they're still kind of having to buttress or back end that cost. Those grants are probably going to fill in. So for the county seems like it's not going to have to actually end up paying funds for the Welcome Center. The bigger question is what it's going to end up having to pay for other sorts of things that are attached for border security, especially because Operation Stonegarden isn't coming through, then kind of what comes next.
Sheriff Napier used this money for equipment, for overtime costs. Now that he doesn't have it with the board's approval, can he still apply for it and hope that perhaps the Board of Supervisors has a change of heart?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that has happened each year is that Sheriff Napier has kept applying for it. So in 2018, they were actually approving the 2017 grant, and in 2018, they decided not to. In 2019, they actually approved 18 grant, and now we're kind of approving and still approving the same 18 grant. So there's a 19, and then of course then possibly a 2020 grant that will be approved. So right now the 2019 grant is out there, so Sheriff Napier can apply for that one, and then a 2020 grant will be coming.
Pima County is the largest border county in the United States. What sort of message does this send to people who look at this region and say, well, if you don't want money from the feds, then what?
The one thing to keep in mind is that Pima County gets money from other kinds of grant funding sources, and there's also a bunch of different kind of task forces that are related to this. So it gets very messy in terms of what this means for law enforcement, because there's other grants and other approvals, and there's other agencies. While Pima County might not accept the money, you're going to see probably Oro Valley Police, you're going to see Santa Cruz, you're going to see Cochise, you're going to see Pinal County do that. One thing that Sheriff Napier pointed out, which I think is probably right, is that all these other guys will still use Operation Stonegarden money, and specifically for Pima County and Pinal County, they're actually flying their own helicopter here to do border missions anyways. So in some ways, it may not really affect the border mission, but it does affect the Sheriff's Department's ability to do some of these overtime operations, and especially in places like Ajo and Arivaca.
You've been covering this for some time. I imagine you're hearing from the public when they come to these meetings. Any concern about what this means for the average taxpayer who's saying, where's my money going, and will it now be funded for border security?
Well, one thing too is that with Stonegarden, there's a pension cost, and there's a long-term pension cost. So as you have deputies who are getting overtime, that means that their pension actually gets more increased. And that was one of the big issues, especially from Supervisor Sharon Bronson, about saying that maybe the feds actually really aren't covering our costs. And so each time we accept Stonegarden money, maybe we're actually going to be on the hook for more money in the future. So there's about, at least the sense is that the government covers about $500,000 the actual cost. So it lays out, and it lays out over a long period of time.
Okay, are we likely to see this on an upcoming agenda again?
Certainly.
Okay, Paul Ingram from the Tucson Sentinel, thank you.
Thank you.
For our special series, Arizona Addicted, we want to visit some of the reporting our colleagues are doing across Arizona public media platforms. This week on NPR 89.1 and AZPM.org, Jake Steinberg looked into some of the challenges people in rural communities face when they try to get help for opioid addiction. Jake, thanks for being here.
Happy to be here.
You visited a methadone clinic in Sierra Vista. Let's begin with what that clinic really does.
So part of what makes opioids so difficult to stop using is once you build up a dependence to opioids, if you stop using them, the withdrawal symptoms become so severe. You get, almost worse than the flu, severe fatigue, loss of complete appetite. You really can't function. So a lot of people can't stop using it. So for that reason, detox, rehab, those types of treatment options don't work for a lot of people. So what methadone clinics do is they use a synthetic opioid called methadone, which has been used to treat addiction since the 60s. And it essentially replaces what that opioid does, the illicit opioid does, in the brain. So you'll get your methadone dosage, and you won't feel those withdrawals. You won't feel that discomfort. And eventually you also won't feel any sort of euphoric effects like you would if you took heroin or oxycodone.
These clinics, though, are mostly in large metropolitan cities. You went to Sierra Vista, the largest city in Cochise County. You met a woman from Elfrida, of all places, which about 20 miles north of Douglas, a very small community. Tell us about Angelica.
Yeah, Angelica Gonzalez initially started off in Phoenix, and that is where she started treatment, the methadone treatment. She got addicted to opioid painkillers because she had been prescribed oxycodone for the chronic pain with her degenerative disc disease in her spine. And so, you just build up a tolerance over time, and she found herself in a place where her withdrawals became too severe that she couldn't stop taking the pills. So she enrolled in this treatment program. About a year ago, she had to leave Phoenix to get away from an abusive relationship. So she left to be with her family in Elfrida.
How does she get from Elfrida to Sierra Vista?
She does not have a car. She doesn't have a license. So she uses MedStar, which is funded by her state insurance. So every Wednesday morning now, she wakes up at about 3 a.m. and gets her 2-year-old daughter up, and they have to get ready for their ride, which comes at around 5 or so, and they'll try to be at the clinic around 6.
What's the need like in Cochise County?
The need is great, but the resources, until very recently, have been very few. A lot of detox facilities, yes, but like I said, those don't work for everybody. In the institutions within Cochise County, the jails and such, there really hasn't been any medication-assisted treatment. There hasn't been any treatment in the jails or programs to get people into treatment once they get out of jail.
How is this affordable? I mean, Angelica is a Medicaid patient, so she has transportation, but how can the state continue to afford this?
Well, the state has received about $75 million from the federal government as part of the federal government's efforts at combating the opioid epidemic. And part of that money has gone towards helping some of these clinics open, starting them at first with grants until they become sustainable. Some of them go towards funding people without insurance to get treatment. Of course, what that doesn't mention is the costs that are saved by the reductions in crime, the people now re-entering the workforce once they've gotten themselves to a stable point in their life. So there hasn't been a full accounting though yet.
And that's Angelica's goal. You mentioned the 2-year-old. There's a lot at stake if this doesn't continue to work for her.
Yeah, absolutely. Her goal is to wean herself off of pain pills. It's being complicated because she is getting surgery right now for, she's got a pretty severe carpal tunnel in her hand. She is in a place right now where, with a lot of people on this kind of treatment, if you are staying the course and you go consistently, you can eventually taper yourself off. But if things become unstable in your life, it's very easy to go back to the way things were before.
Okay, one day at a time for sure.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jake Steinberg, thank you.
Thank you.
A reminder, you can find Jake's full story on azpm.org/Arizona Addicted. And stay tuned into all of Arizona Public Media's platforms as our Arizona Addicted series continues. That's all for now. Thanks for joining us. To get in touch, visit us on social media or send an email to Arizona360@azpm.org and let us know what you think. We'll see you next week.